Hi everybody. Tonight we're going to travel somewhere dusty, somewhere distant, somewhere softly echoing with the jingling of spurs and the low hum of a player piano. Tonight, we'll find ourselves standing outside an old wooden saloon, its name barely visible in the glow of lantern light, its swinging doors creaking just slightly in the evening breeze. And behind those doors? Well, more than whiskey and cards awaited the weary traveler. There was food. Odd food, hearty food, sometimes surprising food. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's take our time, breathe in. Let the warm wind of the frontier brush against your imagination, and as your eyes adjust to the golden glow within, you'll begin to notice the scent. Something frying, something baking, something perhaps even boiling. Yes, this is the story of what was eaten in the Wild West. Not by cowboys on the trail, but by those who stepped through saloon doors after long days in mines on horseback or simply looking for company. It's a tale with 1,000 flavors, most of them covered in gravy. But before we talk about beans and bacon, or mysterious stews, we must understand the role the saloon played in this rough-hewn chapter of American life. Because food, after all, doesn't just appear on a plate. It's tied to people, to places, and to the stories that fill the air like smoke from a campfire. The Wild West Saloon wasn't just a bar. It was more like a social hub, a place of rest and respite, and yes, sometimes of trouble. But most importantly, it was a little taste of something warm in a world that could be awfully cold. From about the 1860s to the turn of the century, these saloons popped up like prairie dogs, especially in boom towns. Some were no bigger than a wooden shack with a barrel of whiskey and a poker table. Others had chandeliers, painted ladies, and dinner menus printed on thick paper. At their heart, saloons were an attempt to bring civilization, or at least a version of it, to the wilderness. And in the same way that a glass of whiskey offered courage, a hot meal offered comfort. But what kind of meals? And how were they cooked when kitchens were no bigger than a closet and fresh ingredients were as rare as rainfall? To answer that, we need to linger a while on the logistics of the West. You see, food in the saloon wasn't like the food we might imagine in a restaurant today. There were no refrigeration trucks or overnight deliveries. Everything came by train, wagon, or horse. And because of that, the menus were limited, but inventive. Some saloons served food only to encourage patrons to stay longer and drink more. These were often simple meals, served free or for a few cents, like pickled eggs, dried sausages, or bowls of salty stew designed to make you reach for your mug again. In fact, free lunch wasn't just a saying. It was a real practice, especially in more developed saloons. But as the old joke went, you get what you pay for. Other saloons, especially in mining towns where workers had cash in hand, went a step further and offered full meals. Steaks sizzling on cast iron, beans slow-cooked over open flames, biscuits hard enough to stop a bullet. These places often employed cooks, and many of them women, immigrants or former trail cooks, who brought with them knowledge of seasoning, of baking, and of making a meal memorable, even in a place made of dust and pine wood. And the atmosphere in a saloon added its own flavor. Imagine candlelight flickering off tin ceilings, the shuffle of boots on wooden floors, the far-off sound of someone badly playing a fiddle, the air heavy with tobacco, perfume, and a hint of whatever was on the stove. Every detail helped shape the dining experience, chaotic yet somehow cozy, unpredictable yet oddly comforting. Now it's important to note that not all saloons were created equal. Some catered to cowboys, others to gamblers, merchants, or railroad men. Some were clean and inviting, others, well, let's just say you didn't want to see the kitchen. But no matter the quality, food was always part of the experience. Because no one wants to gamble on an empty stomach, and even the loneliest drifter needs something warm to fill his belly before sleep. Over the next 21 chapters, we'll take a closer look at exactly what was served, from coffee so strong it could wake the dead, to desserts made from dried apples and desperation. We'll peek into the pots of the past, sample the stories of cooks and customers, and learn why the scent behind the swinging doors mattered just as much as the whiskey on the shelf. So rest easy. Let the story unfold like a checkered napkin on a worn wooden table. We have much to explore. And I promise, by the end, you'll never look at a plate of beans the same way again. There's something quietly poetic about the most ordinary foods, the humble things that filled bellies, not books. In the saloons of the Wild West, while some dishes tried to impress, others endured through sheer reliability. And among these, enduring staples and the holy trinity of beans, biscuits, and bacon stood proud. Not glamorous, but dependable. The kind of food that tasted like survival and stubbornness. And maybe, with a touch of luck, like home. Tonight, let's sit down at a rough-hewn table, our boots a little dusty from the trail. There's a candle flickering in an empty bottle. A tin plate slides across to us with a familiar weight. And there they are, beans, biscuits, and bacon. Again. But tonight, let's see them not just as cowboy food, but as the building blocks of frontier comfort and the surprising centerpiece of many a saloon menu. We begin with beans. There is a kind of romance in the way beans simmer. Slowly, over hours, soaking up spices, memories, and sometimes secrets. In the frontier, beans were more than food. They were predictable, they stored well, traveled light, and fed many. Saloon kitchens adopted beans early on, not just out of necessity, but for their versatility. Some were simple, pinto beans boiled with salt and maybe a hunk of pork if the cook was feeling generous. Others were spiced with chili powder, onions, or even molasses to add depth and richness. In mining towns, Mexican and Texan cooks often brought bold flavors, turning humble beans into smoky, savory, chili-infused stews that danced on the tongue. For the saloon owner, beans were cheap and filling. For the customer, they were warm and familiar. And for the cook, a blank canvas. Some saloons would even add a splash of leftover beer or coffee to the pot, not out of culinary daring, but because it was what they had. And surprisingly, it often worked. Next, the biscuit. Forget the soft, buttery pillows of modern Southern cooking. These were hard, really hard. Sometimes affectionately, and not so affectionately, called cowboy crackers, biscuits in the West were often more practical than pleasurable. Made from flour, water, a bit of fat, and if you were lucky, some baking soda or powder. They were baked in Dutch ovens or cast iron skillets. Their texture ranged from pleasantly chewy to something more suited to roofing material. Yet saloon cooks got creative. Some brushed biscuits with bacon grease or lard to soften the crust and deepen the flavor. Others added bits of dried fruit, or coarse sugar when the occasion allowed, transforming them into something approaching dessert. And while trail biscuits were meant to last for days, those in saloons had the benefit of being fresher. Eaten warm with a slather of molasses, they became a small moment of comfort in an often uncomfortable world. It's worth noting that the biscuit was more than a side dish. It was a tool for scraping plates, for soaking up sauce, even for cleaning one's fingers. In a place where napkins were often wishful thinking, a biscuit was multi-purpose, and then the bacon. Bacon. Salted, smoked, sizzled. The music of bacon in a hot pan could stop a saloon mid-conversation. Its smell traveled farther than a gunshot and was infinitely more welcome. Bacon was not just popular, it was revered. In the West, bacon didn't come in neat little plastic-wrapped slices. It was a thick-cut, heavily salted slab, often cured and hung for weeks. It traveled well, which made it a frontier favorite. When sliced and cooked in saloons, the fat was never wasted. It was poured into tins and reused for frying, baking, and even preserving other ingredients. Some saloons served bacon with eggs if they had chickens nearby. Others laid it beside beans or folded it into stews. But perhaps the most beloved bacon dish was simply bacon on a biscuit. Crunchy, greasy, salty, and perfect with a strong cup of coffee. There were also regional twists. In parts of California and New Mexico, bacon might be dusted with chili powder. In the colder territories, it was sometimes served alongside root vegetables, boiled or roasted, to round out a winter meal. Together, beans, biscuits, and bacon formed the trinity of saloon dining, not because they were the finest foods, but because they were the most adaptable. They met the moment, Whether that moment was a lonely prospector nursing his last coin, or a gang of drovers celebrating a completed cattle drive, they were the foods that didn't ask questions, that forgave rough cooking and embraced improvisation. And most importantly, they filled the gap between hardship and hope. To eat these staples in a saloon was to be reminded that survival could still taste good, and occasionally, with the right cook and a pinch of luck, even delicious. As we continue our journey through Wild West saloon cuisine, remember these three. They are the roots of the tree. Everything else, from fancy pies to questionable oysters, is just the branches. There is a special kind of comfort in a stew, something ancient, something slow. It bubbles gently, not just with ingredients, but with memory and time. In the Wild West saloon, no dish carried more mystery or more possibility than what simmered quietly in the back in a pot blackened by fire and heavy with secrets. Tonight we step into that space. The kitchen, if you could call it that. A tiny smoke-filled room behind the swinging doors. One pot, one cook, and one spoon, long and wooden, swirling stories into every serving. You see, a saloon stew was a living thing, not alive in the wriggling, frightening sense, hopefully, but alive in the way a folk tale is. It changed from day to day. It adapted. It remembered. A stew on Monday might begin with beef and beans. By Thursday, it might carry whispers of chicken, carrots, or even yesterday's biscuit, crumbled for texture. Ingredients weren't wasted. They were reborn. The stew pot was often kept going for days, with new additions folded in like secrets whispered over a poker table. These were sometimes called perpetual stews, hearty broths that never truly emptied, only evolved. You could taste Tuesday and Friday's dinner, and if you were lucky, there'd be more meat than mystery in your bowl. But what exactly went into these bubbling concoctions? That depended on where the saloon was. In Texas, beef was common, often tough, cuts that softened with time. In California, pork might sneak in, especially when Chinese or Mexican cooks added their own regional flair. In the northern territories, elk or rabbit appeared from local trappers. And always, there were beans, onions, garlic, and whatever root vegetable could survive the journey. The term Irish stew became popular, though few versions matched anything you'd find in Dublin. Some stews included dried apples, turnips, or even leftover ale. In more enterprising towns, cooks used lard to sauté ingredients before adding liquid, giving a richer, deeper flavor. The liquid itself could be water, broth, coffee, or, if the budget allowed, a splash of whiskey for warmth, and the seasoning. Now here lies the great divide. Some saloon stews were legendary, known across counties. Cooks guarded their spice blends like gold claims. Chili powder, black pepper, cumin, thyme, and bay leaves snuck in where they could. Others, however, tasted more like warm regret. Under-seasoned, over-boiled, and so thick you could stand your spoon upright in it. Yet people came back, night after night, because even the worst stew was better than an empty plate. It was hot, it was filling, and on a cold prairie night, that counted for more than refinement. Saloon stews also carried social weight. You didn't just eat stew, you shared it. It was served in chipped bowls with thick crusts of bread or old biscuits. It was eaten with laughter, arguments, tall tales, and the clink of mugs. Sometimes, stew meant community. Other times it just meant survival. And behind every pot was a cook. Often underpaid, overworked, and fiercely proud. These weren't chefs with tall hats. They were improvisers, alchemists of leftovers. Many were former trail cooks, women widowed by the harshness of frontier life, or immigrants blending old world techniques with new world scarcity. Some were known only by nicknames: Biscuit Joe, Widow Maureen, Quiet Chin, and each left their mark on the stew. A touch of curry here, a splash of fish sauce there. Things no one expected in a saloon, yet somehow it worked. A traveler in Wyoming once wrote, "I asked what was in the stew and was told everything but the bar stools." I think they may have been joking, I hope. Yes, sometimes the mystery was part of the appeal. A stew could hide a tough piece of meat, a strange vegetable, the last of yesterday's roast, and diners rarely asked questions, perhaps out of politeness, perhaps out of survival instinct. But one thing is certain, when it was good, it was unforgettable. The kind of flavor that followed you for miles, that made you tip your hat to the cook. That reminded you, however briefly, of kitchens left behind in places with proper roofs and gentler lives. So next time you pass a steaming bowl of something brown and bubbling, think of those old saloon pots, of spoons carved from wood, of cooks squinting through the smoke, tasting, stirring, tasting again, not chasing perfection, just chasing warmth, chasing full bellies and stories well fed. Stews were the heart of the Wild West supper, messy, mysterious, and just a little magical. Meat in the Wild West wasn't a delicacy, it was a declaration. It said you'd survived the trail, earned your keep, and maybe even struck gold. And in the warm, flickering heart of the saloon, meat didn't whisper on fine china. It sizzled. It snapped in grease. It greeted you with smoke and bravado. Tonight we're lifting the lid, or maybe the cast iron pan, on the meat offerings that once fed the thirstiest, dustiest, and most determined of frontier folk. These weren't cuts you'd find wrapped in cellophane. No, sir. These were fried, roasted, boiled, and occasionally guessed at. They were fearless, and sometimes a little frightening. Let's begin with the basics. Beef. Cattle were everywhere in the West, trailing up from Texas, across open plains, into towns still barely carved from prairie grass. It's no surprise. Then that beef was a saloon staple. But not all beef was equal. Prime cuts like steak were rare and expensive. If you were lucky, you might get a chuck or a round, tough, chewy, but satisfying if cooked right. Saloon cooks often tenderized these with vinegar, beer, or long hours of slow cooking. The result wasn't elegant, but it was deeply flavorful, especially when slapped onto a tin plate with a scoop of beans and a fried egg. Then there was salted beef, preserved in heavy brine, boiled to soften, and served with whatever starch was handy. It was often a bit gray, a bit chewy, but it filled the belly, and that was enough. Pork followed closely. Easier to cure, often cheaper, and beloved for its fat, pork was a common sight. Bacon, as we've seen, was king, but pork chops, sausages, and even pig's feet showed up, particularly in towns with strong German or Eastern European roots. Saloon sausages were typically coarse, heavily spiced, and often made from, well, we'll say mixed cuts and leave it at that. But what about chicken? Ah, the elusive bird of the West. Chickens were precious. They laid eggs after all, and that made them more valuable alive than fried. Still, fried chicken was a prized dish, especially on Sundays or for traveling dignitaries. If a saloon had fried chicken on the menu, it meant they had access to local farms or very good trade connections. The bird was usually cut into pieces, dredged in flour or cornmeal, and fried in lard until golden and crisp. Served with biscuits and gravy, it was a rare and welcome comfort, the kind of meal that brought a miner close to tears. Then came the game meats, and here the West got creative. Depending on the region, saloons served everything from rabbit and squirrel to venison, elk, and even rattlesnake. Yes, rattlesnake. Said to taste like a cross between fish and chicken, it was often breaded and fried, more for texture than flavor. The novelty alone kept it popular. Deer meat or venison was lean and rich, often stewed or grilled over open flame. In hunting season, it might be served fresh. Otherwise, it was dried into jerky or smoked for longevity. Elk and antelope appeared on menus in Montana and the Dakotas, often roasted whole for special occasions. Then there were the truly brave options: porcupine, badger, raccoon. Not common, but not unheard of either. In desperate towns, or after successful hunts, these creatures found their way onto saloon tables. Cooked slowly, usually in stews or smoked, they were more about survival than pleasure. And let's not forget offal: liver, heart, kidneys, brains. To waste meat was a sin in the West, and saloon cooks knew how to use every part. fried liver, with onions, kidneys sautéed in lard, brains scrambled with eggs. These were delicacies for some, horrors for others. But to many frontier folk, they were simply dinner. Anecdotes from the time tell of cowboy specials, breakfasts of calf brains, bacon, and beans, or miners' platters of pickled pig's feet and fried potatoes. To modern ears, it might sound shocking, but to a weary man in dust-covered boots, it sounded like music. And how was all this cooked? Frying was the method of choice, fast, hot, and dramatic. Meats were dropped into cast-iron pans, often without draining the fat. The sizzle was intoxicating. Roasting was reserved for bigger cuts, whole haunches, birds, or pigs, sometimes skewered over open fires in the yard behind the saloon. Smoking added preservation and flavor. Saloon cellars often had smokehouses attached, especially in cooler climates, and boiling, while less glamorous, was a favorite for tougher cuts or offal, turning the inedible into something resembling stew. What made saloon meat dishes so memorable wasn't refinement, it was audacity. The creativity of using what was on hand. The boldness of flavor from smoke, spice, and fat. The quiet pride of a cook who could turn a squirrel into a satisfying supper. There were no menu boards in most saloons. No names for dishes. You ate what was served. And if it was good, you asked for seconds. If it was bad, well, at least there was whiskey. So next time you hear the pop of grease or catch the scent of something meaty and mysterious on the wind, imagine a saloon cook with sleeves rolled up turning the wildness of the West into something edible, something brave, something fried and fearless. Morning in the Wild West didn't always begin with the crow of a rooster. Sometimes it began with the clink of tin cups and the low murmur of tired voices. Sometimes it began with the scent of burnt coffee drifting through foggy dawn. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it began with eggs fried in bacon grease and biscuits drowning under thick, peppery gravy. In a world that demanded strength, breakfast wasn't optional. It was armor. It was ritual. And in the saloon, that ever-adaptable sanctuary, the morning meal became its own quiet performance. No poker chips, no music, just food, steam, and silence broken only by the scrape of fork on plate. Let's step into a saloon before the day truly begins. The oil lamps still flicker from the night before. A few chairs are overturned. Someone snores softly in the corner. But in the kitchen, something is already hissing. The cook, bleary-eyed and battle-hardened, is making breakfast. At the heart of the saloon breakfast were three constants: eggs, gravy, and coffee. Let's start with eggs. Fresh eggs were, as we know, a luxury on the frontier. But many saloons kept a coop or traded regularly with local farmers. When eggs were available, they were served hot and fast, scrambled with salt and pepper, fried sunny side in bacon fat, or poached if the cook was fancy or French. Saloon cooks didn't bother with finesse. Eggs were cooked in batches with browned edges and yolks firm enough to survive the jostling of a miner's appetite. But even so, there was comfort in them. A warm egg, served alongside meat or beans, was like a promise. Today might be hard, but at least it starts with something good. Sometimes eggs were mixed with bits of leftover meat, onions, or even potatoes, becoming a kind of rustic omelet. Other times, they were eaten with nothing but bread and a splash of hot sauce if available. In the saloons of the Southwest, eggs often came with tortillas instead of biscuits layered with chili or beans. Then came the gravy. Now, gravy in the Wild West wasn't dainty. It was a full-bodied, pepper-flecked, stick-to-your-ribs concoction, made from pan drippings, flour, and milk, when milk could be found. Sometimes called sawmill gravy, it was born of necessity and frugality. After frying bacon or sausage, the cook would use the leftover fat to create a roux, adding liquid to make a thick, creamy sauce. The result? Rich, savory, deeply satisfying. Poured generously over biscuits, eggs, potatoes, anything really, gravy was more than just a topping. It was insulation, against hunger, against cold, against the hard realities waiting outside the saloon's front door. And what would breakfast be without coffee? Saloon coffee was strong, some might say unforgiving. Made by boiling grounds in a large pot, no filters, no finesse. The drink was dark, sometimes gritty, and always hot. It was poured straight into tin mugs and served with a nod, not a smile. Sugar was a rare treat, cream even rarer. Many drank it black, and many claimed it could wake the dead, or at least make you regret staying up so late the night before. Some cooks added eggshells to the pot to settle the grounds. Others swore by a pinch of salt or even a splash of whiskey. Coffee wasn't just a drink. It was the sound of morning, the slosh of a ladle, the sigh of a first sip, the quiet hum of people coming back to life. Together, these three, eggs, gravy, and coffee, formed the core of the saloon breakfast. But the meal could expand, depending on what was on hand. Fried potatoes often made an appearance, especially in towns near farms. Sometimes chopped with onions or peppers, they added heft and heat. In colder regions, saloons might serve porridge, or grits, occasionally sweetened with molasses if the budget allowed. And of course, there was always meat. Leftover pork, sausage patties, slices of salted beef. Some saloons even offered smoked fish near coastal areas, herring, trout, or whatever came in on the morning wagon. But breakfast was more than just food. It was a moment, a chance to breathe, before the day's demands arrived. A place where ranch hands sat beside gamblers, where travelers met townsfolk, where no one talked too loud and everyone sipped slowly. The noise of the night gave way to the quiet of dawn. Saloon keepers understood this. Many opened early just for breakfast, even if the bar itself stayed dry until noon. It was good business. A warm meal meant a grateful customer, and a grateful customer often returned at sundown, thirsty and ready to spend. Some towns had breakfast specials, a full plate for 15 cents. Others offered bottomless cups of coffee for a nickel. But the ritual was the same, hot, heavy, and honest. And when the last plate was cleared and the last cup drained, the saloon shifted once more. The tables wiped down. The cards laid out. The piano tuned. But for a few hours each morning, before the whiskey flowed and the laughter grew rowdy, saloons were havens of quiet sustenance. So the next time you crack an egg into a pan, or sip coffee with half-open eyes, think of that lonely cook in a timber kitchen, stirring gravy with a cast-iron spoon. Think of the tin cups and the biscuit crumbs. Think of the cowboy, the widow, the miner, all beginning their day with the same small luxury, a warm breakfast and a little peace. Sweetness is a luxury, especially in a world built on grit and gravel, where boots wear out faster than friendships and sugar is worth its weight in gold dust. Yet, even in the rough-hewn saloons of the Wild West, sweetness found a way. Tonight, we'll trade the scent of whiskey for the softer smell of baked apples. We'll step into the back corners of saloon kitchens, where flour was scarce, sugar scarcer, but determination plentiful. There we'll discover the quiet art of dessert, not extravagant, not delicate, but soothing in its own rustic way. Because even out west, where wolves howled and tempers flared, there came a moment after supper, a quiet craving for just a little something sweet. Let's start with the foundation: sugar. Refined white sugar was a prized commodity in the 1800s West. Expensive to ship, vulnerable to moisture, and taxed on arrival, it was hoarded, measured carefully, and used sparingly. Only the more successful saloons or those in well-connected towns could afford regular deliveries. Instead, cooks leaned heavily on molasses and sorghum, thick, dark syrups made from sugarcane or sorghum grass. These were cheaper, easier to store, and gave saloon desserts a rich, earthy sweetness. In some cases, even wild honey was used, harvested from local hives and bartered with bee hunters brave or foolish enough to seek them out. So what could you make without sugar, eggs, or reliable ovens? Quite a bit, it turns out. One of the most common sweets was dried fruit pie, if one could stretch the term pie generously. Apples, peaches, or berries were dried during the warmer months, stored in cloth sacks, and rehydrated when needed. Stewed with a bit of molasses, these fruits became the filling for pies made with rough lard-based crusts. The result was dense, chewy, and incredibly satisfying, especially with a cup of black coffee. These pies were often served on Sundays, or after big events like dances or weddings. In some towns, they were even used as currency in local gambling games. Another favorite was Apple Brown Betty, a layered dessert of rehydrated apples, crumbled biscuits or stale bread, molasses, and spices if available. Baked slowly in Dutch ovens, it turned into a warm, spiced pudding that filled the saloon with a scent far sweeter than the saloon's usual aroma of beer and smoke. Cobblers were another go-to. Using whatever fruit was on hand, fresh or preserved, saloon cooks would cover the filling with a crude biscuit or dumpling dough and bake it in cast-iron pans. These desserts weren't pretty, but they were delicious. Sticky, soft, and comforting, they brought diners back to childhood kitchens and faraway homes. In places with a strong German or Dutch influence, simple cakes made with cornmeal or rye flour appeared. Sweetened with molasses and flavored with dried spices, they were often called tea cakes or poor man's sponge. A slice warmed over the stove could make even the gruffest cowpoke pause. And in Mexican-influenced regions, sweet tamales were sometimes served. Masa filled with dried fruit, sweetened with piloncillo, unrefined cane sugar, and steamed in corn husks. Fragrant, soft, and portable, they were a saloon favorite around holidays. One cannot forget fried dough, the simplest of treats. Made from flour, lard, and a pinch of whatever leavening was available, it was rolled out, cut into strips or rounds, and fried until golden. If there was sugar, it was sprinkled on top. If not, molasses or syrup was drizzled. Some saloons served it plain with coffee, while others offered small jars of jam, homemade when possible, as a dipping treat. In colder regions, dried fruits were rehydrated and turned into fritters, sometimes mixed with a touch of brandy or whiskey for flavor. These were especially popular during winter, when fresh produce was non-existent and spirits were needed in more ways than one. Of course, desserts were not served at every meal. In fact, they were often held back for special occasions, a payday, a celebration, or a night when business was slow and the cook had time to experiment. Sometimes a saloon would surprise its customers with a sweet offering, and the mood would shift. Tempers softened. Conversations grew warmer. Even the piano player might play something gentler. One miner wrote in a letter home, "Last night I ate something called prune pudding. It was brown, lumpy, and looked like a boot heel. But it made me feel like a gentleman." There's a kind of magic in that, in turning rough ingredients into comfort, in finding joy at the bottom of a tin bowl. The desserts of the wild West weren't about indulgence, they were about memory, about sweetness earned through sweat and soot, about cooks, often women, often overlooked, who baked as an act of quiet rebellion against the harshness of the world outside their kitchen walls. So next time you stir sugar into your tea or cut into a soft slice of pie, think of those saloon sweets, baked in cast iron, sweetened with courage, served with a wink and a nod. They were more than dessert. They were a small, sweet reminder that even in a land without luxury, people still found time to be kind to themselves. Imagine, if you will, a dusty mining town at the edge of nowhere. The sun has long since dipped behind the hills, and a saloon window glows amber in the fading light. Inside, a man wipes his face with a handkerchief, sets down a tin mug of lukewarm beer, and stares in disbelief at what's just landed in front of him. A plate of oysters. Real oysters. In the middle of the desert. It sounds like a dream, or maybe a hallucination brought on by too much whiskey. But no. In the unpredictable world of Wild West saloons, surprises like this were very real. You see, while we often picture saloons as bastions of simple food, beans, bacon, biscuits, they were also centers of novelty. Places where the most unexpected ingredients could appear like ghosts from another life. Oysters, canned peaches, imported sardines, even pineapple on occasion. These items weren't everyday fare, but they weren't myths either. They were the culinary curveballs of the frontier, and they made saloon dining more exciting than one might expect. Let's start with the oysters. Yes, oysters. Those briny little sea creatures you wouldn't expect to find more than 100 miles from the nearest tide. And yet, thanks to the miracle of 19th century railroads and a growing network of supply chains, fresh oysters made it to places like Denver, Cheyenne, and even Deadwood. Carried in barrels packed with ice or brine, they journeyed thousands of miles to reach inland saloons where they were served with pride and a side of disbelief. But oysters weren't always fresh. Canned oysters were even more common. These were preserved in tins and shipped far and wide, allowing saloon cooks to offer oyster stew, oyster pie, or simply oysters on toast. In some towns, oyster night was a weekly ritual, an indulgent escape from the usual menu. Patrons would come dressed a little nicer, order a little more, and pretend for just an evening that they weren't surrounded by cactus and coyotes. The presence of oysters lent an air of sophistication. They were symbols of the East Coast, of cities, of wealth. To eat oysters in a frontier town was to taste civilization, even if the edges were a bit rusty. Beyond oysters, there was an even more revolutionary element in the saloon pantry. Canned goods. Canned food was a marvel. It didn't spoil easily. It traveled well. It opened up a world of flavors that would otherwise be impossible to maintain in the unpredictable climate of the American West. Canned peaches were a particular favorite. Soft, syrupy, and golden, they were a sweet surprise in a landscape known more for its grit than its grace. Served cold or warmed gently over a stove, canned peaches became dessert when there was no time or talent for baking. A spoonful might be placed over a biscuit, transforming a plain meal into a small celebration. Tomatoes, too, came in cans, used in stews, sauces, or even eaten straight by some. Canned meats like corned beef and potted ham found their way into sandwiches and hash. Even tropical fruits, pineapple, mango, or guava, appeared from time to time, often labeled with exotic stamps and opened with cautious delight. These canned delicacies weren't cheap, but saloons kept them for special occasions or high-paying customers. A man celebrating a lucky poker hand might splurge on sardines with crackers or a tin of imported ham, washed down with better-than-average whiskey. Then there were the truly odd offerings, dishes that walked the line between curiosity and challenge. Take Rocky Mountain oysters, for example. Not oysters at all, but rather the sliced, battered, and fried testicles of young bulls, a cowboy delicacy born of necessity and boldness. Served with hot sauce or vinegar, they were surprisingly popular among those with strong stomachs and stories to tell. Pickled eggs, too, made frequent appearances on saloon counters. Stored in large jars filled with vinegar, salt, and spices, they were often offered free with a drink, partly as a snack, partly to keep patrons thirsty. Their sharp, pungent bite cut through the taste of cheap liquor, and they had the added benefit of lasting practically forever. Other surprises included smoked fish, dried anchovies, even tinned clams. In some areas, smoked oysters were mashed into spreads and served on crackers. Elsewhere, imported cheeses were brought in from the East, hard-aged wheels that could survive long trips and be shaved onto bread or biscuits. The motivation behind all this culinary variety was more than generosity. It was strategy. Saloon. Owners knew that offering something unexpected could keep customers coming back. If a man walked into your saloon and found sardines and coffee waiting instead of just whiskey and beans, he might choose your place over the next. He might stay longer, drink more, tell his friends. The surprise was part of the charm, and in a world where routine could wear a man down, where dust settled into every crevice of life, even a modest twist on dinner could feel like magic. Imagine a table of prospectors arguing about whether the oysters this week were saltier than last, or a tired cattleman biting into canned peaches and closing his eyes for a moment, letting the syrup carry him away from the trail and back to gentler places. So yes, the Wild West had its surprises. Tucked between poker games and piano tunes, you could find a spoonful of pineapple, a pickled egg with your whiskey, or a tin of sardines perched next to a cigar box. And though these things might not seem luxurious by today's standards, they were marvels then. Little luxuries that turned the saloon into a place of endless possibility. Because in the end, a saloon was more than a bar. It was a bridge between worlds, old and new, wild and civilized, dusty and delicious. And sometimes it served oysters. Free lunch, they called it, with a grin, a wink, and a scent of something greasy wafting through the air. To the weary traveler, the miner with empty pockets, or the out-of-luck gambler nursing one final coin, those words were like a hymn, a promise of nourishment without cost, warmth without payment. But in the Wild West Saloon, nothing was ever quite that simple. Tonight, we step into the cunning, curious world of the saloon free lunch, a tradition part marketing genius, part survival mechanism, and part culinary theater. It was a game, and everyone had a role to play. Let's begin with the basics. The concept of a free lunch wasn't born in the West. It existed in big eastern cities long before the first saloon popped up beside a dusty cattle trail. But in the saloons of frontier America, it became something else. A performance of generosity laced with shrewd calculation. The idea was simple. Offer a free midday meal to anyone who bought a drink. One drink, that's it. The food, they said, cost nothing. Of course, the unspoken truth was that the drink, usually watered-down whiskey or beer, was sold at an inflated price, covering the cost of the meal and then some. And if the food was especially salty, well, customers might just order another drink, and another. The cycle continued and the saloon profited. But despite the math behind it, the free lunch held real magic. For many, it was the only hot meal of the day, and for some, the only thing standing between them and an empty stomach. So what was on the menu? Well, don't picture white tablecloths and fine silverware. Picture instead a wooden bar lined with bowls, platters, and plates. An informal buffet set out each day around noon. Hard-boiled eggs, sliced and sprinkled with pepper. Pickled vegetables, cucumbers, beets, onions, glistening in vinegar. Slices of cold sausage or ham sometimes, curled from sitting too long. Bowls of beans heavy with salt and fat. Stale bread, softened by gravy or bacon grease. Occasionally, if the cook was ambitious or the crowd wealthy, there might be fried fish, potato hash, or corned beef. And always, the salt. Salt was the hidden ingredient in every dish, and not for taste but for thirst. Salted meat, salted butter, salted everything. It was the oldest trick in the book. Make the food free, make it tasty, make it salty, and watch as mugs empty faster than you can refill them. Some saloons went further still. They posted signs, free lunch with every drink, no loitering. Others didn't bother with signs at all. The smell of frying fat was enough to draw a crowd, but not everyone played fair. There were those known as free lunch fiends, men who roamed from saloon to saloon, nursing a single beer all day while loading up on food meant to be a side offering. They carried extra bread in their pockets, took meat meant for 5, and disappeared before anyone could object. Some even brought their own utensils. They were part nuisance, part legend. Saloons tried to curb this behavior. Some employed bouncers to watch the buffet. Others limited access to those with full mugs in hand, and a few simply embraced the chaos, calculating that even freeloaders created the illusion of popularity, which drew in paying customers. Because in the end, the free lunch wasn't just about food, it was about image. For many, the free lunch table was the heart of the midday crowd. Conversations buzzed around it. Business deals were whispered over plates. Jokes, arguments, even fistfights sometimes broke out between the pickles and the pork. And through it all, the saloon keeper smiled, because more noise meant more customers. The cooks behind the counter played their own roles, often older women or retired trail hands, experts in stretching ingredients and making food look better than it tasted. A dab of mustard here, a sprinkle of paprika there. These weren't gourmet meals, but they were respectable, and sometimes genuinely good. Especially in towns with stiff competition, saloons took pride in their lunch. Spreads. Some developed reputations. Go to O'Malley's for the pickled tongue, they'd say. But if you want real sausage, get over to Finch and Feather. The free lunch also blurred social lines. At the bar, you might see a banker beside a blacksmith, a prospector beside a poet. For 1 hour each day, hunger was the great equalizer. And while some looked down on the concept, calling it cheap or underhanded, others saw it for what it was, a moment of generosity in a hard world. It wasn't about fine dining. It was about sustenance, about dignity, about giving the lonely, the broke, the desperate a chance to sit down and feel, if only for a few bites, like a part of something. Even when the trick was obvious, even when the whiskey was thin and the ham was mostly gristle, the free lunch worked. It kept the doors swinging, it filled the room, and it turned the saloon from a simple bar into a place of community. So the next time you hear someone say, "There's no such thing as a free lunch," remember the saloon keeper in his apron, the pickled eggs on the counter, the worn-out cowboy quietly spooning beans from a chipped bowl. Because in the Wild West, for all its dust and danger, there really was such a thing. And for those who needed it most, that free lunch meant more than food. It meant hope. There's a certain sound to a saloon at its busiest. Not the music, not the laughter, but the liquid music of mugs clinking, bottles uncorking, and the low glug of something strong pouring into something fragile. It was the heartbeat of the frontier's favorite gathering place. And while much has been said about the food, it's the drinks that gave the saloon its true spirit, quite literally. Tonight, we turn our attention to the glass, to the bottles behind the bar, to the brown, the gold, the bitter, the sweet. This is the liquid side of the saloon meal, a rich, sometimes risky, always interesting array of drinks that helped wash down beans and biscuits, lifted moods, and, in many cases, clouded judgment. Let's begin at the beginning, with whiskey. Whiskey was the saloon's bread and butter, or rather, its rye and corn. It was the drink of choice for cowboys, gamblers, miners, and drifters alike. Cheap, strong, and available, it came in many names and many forms, and not all of them safe. Frontier whiskey was rarely aged and often homemade. Some of it was imported from Kentucky or Tennessee, yes, but much was locally distilled and rougher than a gravel road. There were whispers of whiskey cut with tobacco juice, kerosene, or even gunpowder. And while such tales were likely exaggerated, they weren't entirely baseless. But when it was good, it was warming, comforting. Served in short glasses or tin cups, it was sipped neat, or tossed back with a grimace and a nod. It didn't ask for mixers or ice. It stood on its own, bold and unapologetic, like the land itself. Saloons often had their own house blend, usually the cheapest available, and regulars learned to tolerate, or even love, its peculiar burn. For a few cents more, you might get a smoother pour. For a few cents less, well, you were gambling twice. Next came beer. Beer in the Wild West was not the crisp, cold lager we think of today. Refrigeration was limited, ice was a luxury, and preservation was tricky. So beer was often served warm, cloudy, and foamy, more like a bitter ale than a bubbly brew. Still, it was incredibly popular. Saloons stored barrels in cool cellars or buried them in the ground. Some towns had their own breweries, producing small batches of local beer flavored with hops, barley, or even pine. German immigrants especially brought brewing traditions with them, and towns with a strong German presence often boasted better beer. In more established saloons, beer was served in glass mugs or steins. In frontier shacks, you might drink from whatever was cleanest, or at least least dirty, but not every saloon drink was alcoholic. Coffee, that ever-faithful companion of the West, was always available. Strong, black, and often thick enough to chew, it was brewed in great pots over open flames or wood stoves. Grounds settled at the bottom of the cup, and more than one cowboy cracked a tooth on an unfiltered sip. Coffee was served with breakfast, of course, but also late into the night. Gamblers drank it to stay sharp. Barkeeps drank it to stay awake. Drifters sipped it alone, watching the moon rise through fogged-up windows. Sometimes sugar was available, sometimes not. Milk? Rare. Whiskey as creamer? Not unheard of. There were also medicinal drinks, or at least drinks that claimed to be, tonic water, bitters, herbal elixirs, all promised to cure what ailed you. Liver pain, snake bite, broken hearts. Some were made by traveling salesmen. Others were mixed behind the bar using mysterious brown bottles and a generous splash of marketing. Sarsaparilla was a favorite among the temperance crowd and younger patrons. A sweet-spiced root beer-like drink, it gave the illusion of indulgence without the consequences. Served cold over chipped ice when available, it was a welcome treat, especially for those avoiding stronger spirits. Lemonade, made from powdered mix or squeezed by hand, was offered in fancier establishments. And in desert towns, tamarind, water, a tangy, lightly fermented drink, could be found in Mexican-run saloons. Then came soda water, or what passed for it. Carbonated beverages were a new craze in the late 1800s, and while rare in the deep frontier, they began to show up in larger towns with railroad access. Mixed with flavored syrups, soda water was often seen as a luxury. In some saloons, it was poured over whiskey for a fancy drink, a forerunner of the highball. But most folks drank what they knew, what they trusted, and that meant whiskey, beer, and black-as-night coffee. Drinks weren't just refreshments, they were rituals. A round of whiskey to seal a deal, a shared beer after a cattle drive, a solitary coffee while the rest of the town slept. In the saloon, the drink in your hand told your story. Whether you were celebrating, mourning, plotting, or simply passing time. And saloon keepers knew this well. They stocked their shelves accordingly, mixed drinks to match moods, and poured with a practiced eye. Some even developed reputations for their specialties. Jake's lemon bitters will cure your headache, they'd say. Or, ask Molly for the tamarind, she brews it herself. So the next time you lift a glass, whatever's in it, think of that saloon, dimly lit and gently swaying with laughter. Think of the barkeep pouring from a dusty bottle, the cowboy cradling his mug like a secret, the gambler sipping slowly, eyes never leaving the table. The drinks of the Wild West weren't always safe, or clean, or even legal, but they were honest, in their own way. And they made the saloon more than a place to eat. They made it a place to feel joy, sorrow, warmth, regret, one sip at a time. Somewhere in the back of every saloon, beyond the clink of glasses and the shuffle of boots, past the curling smoke of cigars and the laughter of cards well played, there was always someone stirring a pot, often unseen, rarely celebrated, and almost never thanked. The saloon cook was the quiet soul who made the place more than just a watering hole. Without them, there were no breakfasts to greet the dawn, no stews to soften the evening, no free lunches to keep the crowds coming. Tonight, let us step beyond the swinging doors and into the kitchen, if you could call it that. Let us meet. The heart of the saloon, the keeper of the stove, the wielder of knives and ladles, the cook. The saloon cook wore no white hat. Their uniform was more likely a grease-stained apron, a rolled-up sleeve, and a look of weary determination. They worked in conditions most of us would flee from, in small, stifling rooms, with poor ventilation, meager supplies, and the constant pressure of feeding a crowd that rarely said thank you. And yet, the cook persisted. Every day, every meal. So who were they? They were, in many cases, people on the edge, just like everyone else in the West. Former trail cooks, retired soldiers, widowed women, immigrants hoping to save enough for something better. Some had learned to cook from necessity. Others had once worked in restaurants far away, in cities with linen tablecloths and full spice racks. But in the West, they all ended up behind the same iron stove. It was a hard life, but one with purpose. And in a town where everyone had a story, the cook's was often one of quiet survival. The saloon cook's work began before sunrise and ended long after the last plate was scraped. There were no shifts, no days off, just a constant rhythm of chopping, stirring, baking, and boiling. In the heat of summer, the kitchen could become unbearable. In winter, it was the only warm place for miles. Supplies were always unpredictable. One week there might be fresh pork and onions, the next, nothing but dried beans and molasses. A good cook could turn whatever arrived in the back door into something edible, and sometimes even delicious. Creativity wasn't optional. It was survival. Stretch the stew, save the drippings, turn stale bread into pudding, season with whatever's left, hide the old meat with salt, the sour flour with spice, and always, always cook enough, but not too much. Waste was unforgivable. Despite the pressures, many cooks developed pride in their work. They became known by name, or at least nickname. There was Biscuit Mary, who could bake without measurements, One-Eyed Tom, who claimed to make chili hot enough to start a bar fight, and Old Sam, who made the best gravy between Denver and Dodge. Customers learned to spot when a cook changed, when the eggs came out rubbery or the biscuits turned to stone. A good cook kept the regulars happy. A great cook made the saloon famous. But cooks did more than just feed. They listened. The cook heard every tale shouted through the pass window. They knew who was broke, who was lovesick, who was running from something. They watched the bar from the shadows and measured the town's mood by the number of empty plates returned. And sometimes when no one was looking, the cook gave a little extra. A ladle more stew to the man who hadn't eaten all day. A warm biscuit for the girl waiting in the corner. A second cup of coffee for the traveler whose hands shook from cold or fear. The cook's kindness was quiet. It didn't ask for payment or thanks. It came in the form of heat, salt, fat, and the unspoken understanding that everyone, no matter how hardened, needed to eat. Saloon keepers understood the value of a good cook. The best ones were paid well, protected fiercely, and given wide leeway in their kitchens. But others were treated poorly, overworked, and replaced as soon as they burned a roast or asked for a raise. Some cooked in silence. Others sang while they worked or cursed in languages no one else understood. But they all shared one thing: resilience. The cook was the one who kept the saloon's heart beating during the slow hours, who kept the coffee hot for the late night, gambler, who rose before the rooster to make breakfast for men too tired to speak, who endured the smoke, the heat, the noise, and still managed to put food on the table. So next time you imagine a Wild West saloon, don't stop at the poker table or the bar. Walk a little further back past the stacked barrels and the broom leaning against the wall. Find the door with a curtain instead of hinges, and peek inside. There you'll see a stove, always burning, a pot, always bubbling, a figure bent over, a cutting board, or testing gravy with the back of a spoon. And you'll understand, perhaps for the first time, that the saloon's true soul wasn't found in its whiskey or its cards. It was found in the kitchen, behind the stove, in the hands of a tired cook making one more meal for one more stranger, in a world that often offered neither comfort nor kindness. But here, in this room, you could have both, served hot with a side of silence. Some meals are for the body, others, quietly, gently, are for the soul. And in the saloons of the American West, where the tables were scarred with knife marks and the benches groaned under the weight of boots and burdens, meals did both. They fed the hungry, yes, but more than that, they stitched together the daily fabric of life. They turned strangers into acquaintances, allies into rivals, and weary men into something like a community, even if only for the length of a bowl of stew. Tonight we take a seat at one of those long shared tables. The light is dim, the air warm with the scent of beans and bacon. A game of cards wraps up at the far end. Someone tunes a fiddle in the corner, and beside us, a man nods and slides over a half loaf of bread without saying a word. This is not a fine restaurant. There are no menus, no place cards, but make no mistake, there is etiquette here. Unspoken, unwritten, yet deeply respected. Let's begin with the table itself. Most saloons didn't have dining rooms in the traditional sense. Food was served at the bar, on shared wooden tables, or sometimes at repurposed poker tables between games. The space was fluid, like the town itself, constantly shifting to meet the needs of the moment. At lunch, the tables filled with miners and merchants. At breakfast, drovers sat beside newspapermen. At supper, you might see cowboys passing biscuits. to preachers. The divisions of wealth, profession, and past faded slightly when food arrived, and that's where the first rule appeared. Share. If there was a space at the table, it wasn't your space for long. Newcomers joined freely. A nod was the only permission needed. Plates moved aside. Room was made. And suddenly, you were no longer eating alone. Of course, that didn't mean everyone talked. Many ate in silence, focused on their plates, their thoughts, their sore backs. But silence was not rudeness. It was privacy, respected and earned. Conversation came naturally when it did, and when it didn't, no one forced it. Still, when words flowed, they flowed warmly. Stories were traded over gravy and coffee. Tales of faraway places, lost loves, near-death escapes, and minor miracles, all served alongside bowls of beans and slices of bread. No one fact-checked. No one cared if the story changed from week to week. It was the rhythm that mattered, the way a tale could turn a bland biscuit into something rich with meaning. And the laughter, when it came, rolled through the saloon like thunder, shaking the dust from the rafters. Now, table manners in the West were a different beast. There were few forks, even fewer napkins. Knives were often personal, brought in on belts and used for both slicing meat and scratching names into the table. Hands were a common utensil, and licking fingers wasn't frowned upon so much as expected. But messiness didn't mean disrespect. In fact, there were rules. Don't reach across another man's plate. Don't talk with your mouth full, unless the story's really good. Don't take the last biscuit without offering it. Don't waste food. Don't complain unless you're cooking tomorrow. And whatever you do, don't insult the cook. Not unless you were looking to wear your soup instead of eat it. Sometimes food was passed family style, big pots in the middle, everyone serving themselves. Other times the barkeep brought out plates one at a time, shouting names or descriptions. Stew for the tall fellow with the limp, bacon and eggs, if the eggs are still eggs. It was chaotic, but somehow it worked. There was also a kind of hierarchy at play. Regulars got first dibs. Old-timers got extra coffee. Strangers were watched, not with suspicion, but curiosity. How a man ate told you things. Was he slow and careful, fast and loud? Did he leave food untouched? Or lick the plate clean? Did he offer a bit of his sausage to the skinny kid 2 stools down? In saloons, food was a language and everyone spoke it. Occasionally, dining became performance. Someone might tell a story so long and winding that his stew went cold before the punchline. Another might serenade the table with a mouthful of biscuit. In some towns, contests broke out. Who could eat the most beans, the hottest chili, the sourest pickle? These events were rarely planned. They just happened. Like rainstorms or arguments or the sudden hush when a sheriff walked in, and when fights broke out, which they sometimes did, it was rarely over the food. It was over the last sip of beer or a game gone wrong, or words said too loud too fast. But even then, someone usually stepped in before the stew got spilled. Women, when they dined in saloons, were treated with a kind of distant reverence. Whether cooks, entertainers, or travelers, their presence at the table shifted the mood, calmed it usually. Language grew gentler, posture straightened. Some men even remembered to use their handkerchiefs. Children, on the rare occasions they appeared, were doted upon, given extra biscuits, allowed to dip fingers in molasses, and told tall tales by grizzled men who, for a moment, remembered what it was like to be small. So yes, dining in a saloon was messy. It was loud, it was imperfect, but it was also intimate. It was real. It was a daily ritual that reminded everyone, no matter how far from home, how long from the trail, or how dark the road ahead, that they belonged somewhere. Even if just for the length of a meal. So the next time you sit down to eat, imagine that wooden table. Scarred and stained, but steady. Imagine the stew, the bread, the voices, the stranger who passed you the salt, the old-timer who offered the last piece of bacon. Because in the Wild West saloon, a meal wasn't just a necessity, it was a bond. There is a warmth that lives not in the glass of whiskey, nor in the clatter of poker chips, but in the steady, quiet breath of a fire burning low behind a half-closed door. It smells of grease and wood smoke, of onions frying in a cast-iron pan, of bread just beginning to brown beneath a tin lid. It is not a grand warmth, but it is honest, and it rises every day from the kitchen of the saloon. Tonight we duck behind the bar, past the stack of mugs, the barrel of pickles, and the shelf, with the half-empty jar of chili powder. We push through a worn curtain or lean around a crooked doorframe, and there it is, the saloon kitchen. Not much to look at, but so much to feel. The first thing to notice is the fire. There is no stove as we know it. Not electric, not gas, no knobs to turn, no timers to beep. Just fire, built by hand, fed with care, and judged by the eye. Wood is stacked nearby in uneven piles, pine for quick heat, oak for a longer burn. Some kitchens use coal when they can afford it, but most rely on what the nearby land offers. In the early morning before the sun crests the hills, the cook is already at the hearth, kneeling, blowing, coaxing flame from ember. It's a ritual as old as memory, a daily prayer of sparks and ash. Once it catches, the day begins. Cooking is done on open flames or in heavy black stoves made of iron. Franklin stoves, cast iron ranges, or sometimes just fire pits lined with bricks. Pots hang from hooks or sit directly on the coals. Dutch ovens are buried in hot ashes, lids piled with embers to create makeshift baking chambers. There are no digital thermometers, no ovens that hum softly with precision. Everything is done by instinct, by sound, by smell. A good cook can hear when grease is too hot, smell when bread is near to burning, feel the temperature of a pan by holding their hand above it. Mistakes are easy, and sometimes dangerous. Burns are common, on hands, arms, even faces. But over time, the cook becomes a kind of fire whisperer, adjusting logs like a conductor fine-tuning an orchestra. The tools of the trade are few, but treasured. A heavy skillet, blackened by years of use, seasoned with bacon grease and thyme, a long-handled spoon carved from hickory or ash, a battered cleaver, a chef's knife perhaps if fortune smiled, more often a hunting knife pressed into kitchen duty. There's a cutting board, stained and scarred, and a countertop that might once have been a door, rolling pins made from bottles, biscuit cutters repurposed from tin cans, bowls carved from wood, and always a towel, slung over a shoulder, used to wipe sweat, clean hands, grasp hot handles, or swat flies. There is no waste. Every tool matters, every item has a story. That ladle was my uncle's, someone might say. He used it on the Chisholm Trail. And then they stir chili with it, same as he did. Then comes the sound. Not loud, but constant. The low hiss of fat in a pan, the crackle of fire under a pot, the creak of wooden spoons scraping the bottom of a pot of beans, the thunk-thunk of a knife chopping onions, the occasional clang as a pan is dropped, a curse muttered under breath. These are the sounds of work, of care, of time. Sometimes music slips in, a cook humming while stirring, or the faint echo of a fiddle from the saloon floor. But mostly it is the kitchen's own rhythm. It doesn't need accompaniment. It is its own song, and oh, the smell. If the bar is where stories are told, the kitchen is where memories are made. The scent of bacon and biscuits drifting through a cold morning, the sharp hit of garlic thrown into hot fat, the slow, earthy perfume of stew bubbling for hours, the sweetness of molasses poured over fried dough, and always, always the smoke. Dry, tangy, and faintly sweet. It clings to clothes, to hair, to memory. That smell is the true signature of the saloon. Long after the poker hands are folded and the whiskey bottles emptied, it's the scent of the kitchen fire that lingers. The saloon kitchen is not just a place of cooking. It is a place of quiet miracles. A cook, given a sack of flour, a lump of lard, and a bit of dried fruit, can make something that silences a room. With bones and leftovers, they conjure a soup that warms the chest and calms the mind. They stretch, meals meant for 3 to feed 10. They find ways to make bitter greens taste like spring and overcooked meat seem intentional. It is not glamour. It is not fame. It is care, practiced daily, under pressure, in heat, in smoke, and despite the hardships, there is joy when the bread rises just right. When someone calls out from the bar, "Best stew in 5 counties," when a traveler asks what smells so good, when a child peeks around the curtain and says, wide-eyed, "Can I have another biscuit?" That's when the cook smiles, perhaps the only smile they'll allow themselves that day. So if you ever find yourself in an old saloon, don't just admire the bar or the piano or the polished brass rail. Look toward the back, where the real warmth lives. Behind that curtain, behind the fire, is the kitchen, small, smoky, and sacred. Because there, in that humble space, someone is making the world a little softer, a little safer, and a little more delicious. One wooden spoon at a time. There's a quiet beauty in the way a kitchen absorbs a culture, not with trumpets or banners, but with spices and steam. In the Wild West saloon, where dust coated everything and meals often clung to simplicity like a lifeline, something remarkable happened. The flavors of distant homelands began to bubble into the stew pot. Tonight we follow the scent of garlic that doesn't quite belong, the tang of vinegar unfamiliar to the prairie, a shape of bread not round like a biscuit but long, braided, or flat. These are not accidents. These are the traces of immigrants, cooks, families, laborers, and wanderers who brought with them recipes, memories, and tastes of places left far behind. And in the kitchens of the American frontier, the saloon became one of the first unlikely test kitchens of multicultural America. Let's start in the East, with the Germans. German immigrants arrived in droves during the 1800s, settling across the Midwest and into the frontier with a kind of culinary discipline that saloon keepers quickly came to admire. They brought with them sausages, smoked, cured, spiced, and packed with flavor. Bratwurst, knockwurst, liverwurst. These were not just food. They were a strategy, hearty, durable, and perfect for bar rooms. In towns like Milwaukee, St. Louis, and even as far west as Helena, Montana, it wasn't unusual to find a plate of sausage and kraut served beside a mug of beer. The kraut, sour, sharp, and fermented, was strange to some palates, but once paired with pork, it became a staple. Pretzels, too, found their way onto saloon counters. Salted, dense, and perfect for soaking up ale, they were embraced with enthusiasm, and perhaps a bit of confusion over how to pronounce their names. From the south, the Mexican influence flowed like a gentle tide. In New Mexico, Arizona, California, and parts of Texas, saloon fare often included tamales, tortillas, and chili, long before such dishes were thought of as American. Corn masa, pork stewed with chilies, beans cooked with garlic and cumin. These weren't foreign foods in these regions. They were local, native, and essential. In saloons run by Mexican families, you might find enchiladas served beside fried eggs or bowls of pozole warming over fires. The locals, often skeptical at first, soon became devoted. There was power in that heat, that spice, that careful layering of flavor. It woke the tongue in ways bland stew never could. And as with all good things, the flavors traveled, picked up by curious cooks in other regions, modified with local ingredients, renamed, reinterpreted. But the soul of the dish stayed strong. Then came the Chinese. In towns shaped by railroads and gold, Chinese laborers became essential, and so did their food. Chinese cooks, often relegated to the margins of frontier life, found quiet, but lasting, influence in the kitchens of saloons and boarding houses. They brought rice, rare in some regions but adored where it was available. They brought soy sauce, ginger, dried mushrooms, and tea. They stir-fried with speed and economy, turning scraps into meals. Some saloons served what they called Oriental hash, meat and vegetables quickly seared with garlic and sauce. The flavors were unfamiliar, but the satisfaction was universal. And the tea, hot, strong, served with or without sugar, became a favorite among cowhands and gamblers needing a sobering sip late at night. Despite prejudice and exclusion, Chinese culinary skill earned grudging respect. The food was fast, efficient, and deeply flavorful, 3 things every saloon owner valued: From across the Atlantic came the Irish. Potatoes, cabbage, stews heavy with mutton or beef. Simple, hearty, and built for endurance. Irish saloon cooks often worked behind the scenes, serving up shepherd's pie or box tea when ingredients allowed. Soda bread was made with sour milk and baked on griddles. Nothing was wasted. Every crust became a crouton, every bone became broth. Whiskey, of course, was the cultural gift best remembered, but the food had its own impact. Warm, humble, and generous. It matched the tone of the saloons that served it. Even the Italians made their mark. Macaroni was one of the earliest foreign foods to be accepted, especially in cities. Dry pasta, cooked with butter, sometimes cheese and, if the stars aligned, a tomato sauce, was served alongside meats or as a meal in itself. Garlic bread made its appearance in makeshift forms. Stale saloon loaves rubbed with garlic and toasted in bacon fat. And though few frontier saloons had proper ovens for pizza, they might serve flatbreads with herbs and oil, hinting at what was to come. Olive oil, once strange and slippery to many American cooks, began to show up in saloon kitchens brave enough to experiment. It wasn't always appreciated, but it was remembered. And so the saloon, rough as it was, became a cradle of culinary fusion. It wasn't about authenticity. It was about adaptability. A German sausage might be served with Mexican beans. Chinese noodles might be topped with stew. Irish cabbage could end up in an Italian soup. The frontier didn't care much for borders, only for what could be made from what was on hand. Some patrons resisted. "This ain't stew," they'd mutter. But others leaned in. "Whatever that was, give me another plate." And over time, the meals changed. Not completely, not overnight. But they grew, richer, stranger, better. So when we remember the saloon, we must remember the hands behind the ladles. Hands that once stirred sauce in Sicily, chopped ginger in Guangdong, or rolled dough in Bavaria. These cooks, these immigrants, these voices from other shores helped shape the flavor of the West. Not with fanfare, but with patience. One dish at a time. The Wild West Saloon was not a place of great luxury, but it was a place of surprising rhythm, one dictated not by the clock, but by the seasons. Out on the frontier, the weather was no mere backdrop. It was a force that shaped everything, especially the food. Tonight we step into the kitchen once more, but this time we listen for the wind outside. We pay attention to the dust, or the frost, or the dripping eaves. Because in the saloon what was cooked, served, and shared depended deeply on what the world outside the walls was doing. Whether the sun was scorching, the snow was piling, or the first green leaves were daring to unfurl. Let us follow the seasons and taste how they turned the menu. One ladle, one biscuit, one stew at a time. Winter, the season of stew and smoke. Winter on the frontier was not gentle. Snow blanketed the plains, winds howled through cracks in every wall, and supply, wagons slowed or stopped altogether. In those months, the saloon kitchen became more vital than ever. A place not just of food, but of heat, light, and gathering. The menu turned hearty, out of necessity. Stews thickened into near-solid masses, packed with beans, root vegetables, dried meat, and anything that would last in a cellar. Salt pork was a mainstay. Smoked venison made rare appearances, as did preserved sausage or ham hung from the rafters. Biscuits were baked heavier, served piping hot with gravy. If there was milk, it went into chowders or was scalded for a hot drink. Oatmeal and porridge returned to fashion, sometimes sweetened with molasses, sometimes left plain, just hot fuel for cold mornings. And coffee, strong, black, bitter, never stopped boiling. Men lined up for it before dawn, their hands wrapped in scarves, their breath puffing clouds as they waited by the fire. The kitchen itself was a refuge. Cooks wore layers and worked close to the flames, their breath fogging in the cold air that seeped through the door frames. The smell of burning wood and bacon fat was the perfume of survival. Spring, the thaw of freshness. When spring finally arrived, it came with a kind of disbelief. Snow turned to slush, then mud, then something like hope. Menus brightened, if briefly. Wild greens were the first signs: dandelion leaves, wild onion, miner's lettuce. Cooks who knew the land would gather these in the early mornings, returning with baskets of sharp, peppery brightness. These weren't served raw, but quickly sautéed or stirred into soups to bring color and sharpness to the bowl. Eggs became more plentiful as hens resumed laying. Milk returned to the table. With luck, there might be early rhubarb or overwintered carrots. Soft, yes, but sweet. Biscuits grew lighter. Meat was still mostly dried or preserved, but there was more of it. Traps brought in fresh rabbit. A lucky hunter might offer squirrel or even early game birds. There was a sense of renewal, lighter meals, quicker cooking. The fire didn't need to roar, it could simmer. And outside, customers sat closer to the windows. Doors stayed open longer. The saloon sighed with relief. Summer, the season of spoilage and surprise. Summer in the West was a double-edged knife. On one side, abundance. On the other, rot. Fresh produce from nearby farms, berries from the hills, corn from the fields. All began to arrive. Tomatoes, onions, green beans. Cooks grew bold. Salsas were made. Beans were boiled with fresh herbs. Fried green tomatoes found their way onto plates. Even pickles took on new life, crisper, spicier. But the heat was unforgiving. Meat spoiled fast. Butter melted even before it hit the pan. Bread went moldy. Milk turned sour overnight. Ice, when available, was treasured like gold and used sparingly. To survive summer, cooks turned to quick frying, fast stewing, and preservation tricks learned from generations past. Salt was used liberally. Vinegar became essential. Food was served fresh and fast, or it wasn't served at all. Menus also grew lighter in spirit. Cold dishes, cured ham, sliced cheese, pickled eggs, fresh bread, became more common. Beer flowed more freely, and lemonade, sweet or tart, became a saloon's secret weapon. In the evenings, when the heat relented just slightly, the kitchen, fire could grow again, and out came grilled meat, fried pies, and late-night bowls of chili shared under open windows. Autumn, the pantry, rebuilds. Autumn was the time of planning, of pickling, salting, smoking, storing. The air turned crisp. Cooks breathed easier. Vegetables could sit on shelves again. Meat could hang in cool corners without turning. The frantic pace of summer eased. Apples arrived, and with them came crisps, pies, and spiced cakes. Pumpkins and squash were roasted, mashed, baked into biscuits. Beans were dried. Corn was ground. Jars lined up on shelves. Jams, relishes, cured vegetables. The kitchen grew full. Soups returned. Gravies thickened. Butter reappeared on bread. And in some towns, a sense of harvest celebration took root. Informal, impromptu, but real. Have an extra helping, someone would say. There's plenty, now. And in those golden months, saloon food became more generous. Not because life was easier, but because people knew winter was coming back. It always did. The seasons in the Wild West weren't just background scenery. They were co-authors in every recipe, silent partners in every bite. And the saloon, scrappy as it was, danced to their rhythm. Sometimes barely keeping up, sometimes leaning ahead with hope. So when you imagine the saloon kitchen, don't picture it frozen in time. Picture it moving through the year, bending, stretching, inventing. A place not of rigid menus, but of living, breathing meals, shaped by wind. And sun and snow, because the West was wild. But the food, season by season, found a way to feel like home. There's something quietly powerful about a piece of pie. It doesn't sing. It doesn't shout. It just sits there, humble, golden, waiting. And when the first bite comes, it does something no stew or whiskey can quite match. It softens the edges of a hard day. In the Wild West, where comfort was scarce and sweetness even scarcer, a good dessert was more than indulgence. It was an act of kindness, a slice of peace, a moment of memory, sometimes of home, sometimes of nothing but the warmth of cinnamon and sugar against a cold metal fork. Tonight, we open the door to the saloon kitchen once more, just as the plates are being cleared and the evening has grown soft. Behind the stove, something sweet is being stirred. Let's take a closer look at the pies, puddings, and half-forgotten treats that gave the West its rare and precious sweetness. The pie. More than a slice in saloons lucky enough to have flour, fat, and fruit, or some combination of the three, pie was a favored ending to a meal. The crust was never flaky in the French sense. It was often thick, sometimes even hard, made from lard and flour with barely enough water to hold it together. But when filled with apples, peaches, dried berries, or even mashed sweet potatoes, it took on a different character. Baked slowly, in Dutch ovens or iron pans, these pies weren't delicate, but they were honest. Apple pie was the most common. Dried apples were stewed with molasses, a pinch of cinnamon if available, and poured into a crust that often had to be patched. Like a worn coat, some cooks added breadcrumbs or crushed crackers to stretch the filling or soak up excess juice. Berry pies, blackberry, elderberry, chokecherry, appeared in late summer, sometimes with bits of biscuit dough dropped on top in place of a second crust, forming what we'd now call a cobbler. They were sticky, staining, and beloved. Savory pies also had their place. Mince pie, filled with meat, sweet, dried fruit, and spices, was a bridge between supper and dessert. Strange by modern standards, it was a holiday favorite, especially among immigrants from Britain and Ireland. Puddings. Sweetness from scraps puddings were where the real kitchen magic happened. Not the creamy, custardy kind we imagine today, but hearty, bread-based dishes that made use of every leftover crust and crumb. Bread pudding was the staple, made with stale bread soaked in milk, or water when milk ran short, sweetened with molasses or syrup and spiced with nutmeg or clove if someone had hoarded such treasures. It was baked until just set. Raisins were added when fortune allowed, and when they were present, they were savored one by one. Cornmeal puddings, too, were common. Stirred slowly over a fire, sweetened with sorghum, and flavored with dried fruit or even grated carrots, they were warming and filling. Dessert that stuck to the ribs and lingered in the memory. Boiled puddings, tied in cloth and simmered for hours, were served during holidays or on slow Sundays. They took patience and firewood, two things in short supply, but their dense texture and rich sweetness made them worth it. Cakes of necessity, cakes as we think of them today, tall, frosted, fluffy, were rare in saloons, but simpler versions did exist. Depression cake before the Depression, made without eggs, butter, or milk, relied on chemical leavening, applesauce, and spices to give rise and flavor. Sometimes called war cake or vinegar cake, it could be made from pantry scraps and still come out tasting like celebration. Griddle cakes, sweetened with molasses and dotted with dried fruit, were sometimes served warm with a dab of grease or a splash of syrup. And gingerbread, dense, dark, and sharply spiced, appeared in towns with trade access or ambitious cooks. Sweets that time. Forgot some desserts of the frontier have faded into memory, their names barely clinging to the edge of cookbooks. Slump, grunt, and pandoti, odd names for odd dishes. These were fruit desserts topped with biscuit dough or torn bread, steamed instead of baked, or flipped mid-cooking. Their forms were loose, their textures strange, but their flavors rich and comforting. There were fried pies, pockets of dough filled with fruit preserves, sealed and cooked in hot lard. Easy to carry, hard to resist. Molasses candy was pulled by hand into chewy ropes and wrapped in wax paper, often shared with children or sold by the piece to travelers. Even dried apple rings dipped in syrup and left to harden became candied fruit, a treat worth saving for the coldest nights. The moment after dessert in the saloon wasn't always expected. Often it came as a surprise. A small plate passed quietly to a man who'd lost at cards. A second helping offered to a woman with a tired look. A bite-sized something saved for a regular who always said, "Thank you." There was no ceremony, no silver, spoons or linen napkins. just sweetness in its purest, most humble form, a gift from cook to customer, from hearth to heart. And when dessert did appear, the mood softened. Conversation slowed. People sat back, let out breaths they didn't know they'd been holding. The day, for just a few moments, tasted better. So next time you hear someone say the West was all grit and grit alone, remember the pie. Remember the pudding, the molasses candy, the biscuits soaked in berry juice. Remember the cook who scraped together a dessert from scraps because someone needed it more than they let on. The treats of the frontier may be forgotten by name, but their kindness, their quiet, golden warmth is still with us. By midnight, the saloon had changed its rhythm. The laughter had quieted to murmurs, the piano had lost its melody to a single wandering chord, and the lanterns burned lower, as if trying not to disturb the dreams just beginning to gather at the edges of the room. But some souls were still awake, still hungry, still sitting in the corners, eyes heavy, bellies emptier than they'd like. These were the late-night eaters, the gamblers, the travelers, the men with dust on their boots and worries in their minds. And for them, the saloon had one more offering, the midnight meal. It wasn't on the chalkboard. It wasn't announced. It wasn't always fresh. But it was warm and quiet and served with a kind of care that only exhaustion could summon. The kitchen by now was no longer bustling. The fire had been banked, the big pots scrubbed down or left soaking in water gone cool. But one burner remained lit. One kettle kept warm, and one cook, if not entirely awake, was still close by, sipping coffee, nursing sore feet, and waiting for that soft knock on the side door. Midnight meals weren't feasts. They were patchworks. Leftover beans stirred back to life with water and salt. The last two biscuits reheated over a flame. A piece of salted pork sliced thin and fried until crisp. A spoonful of stew, scraped from the bottom of the pot, served. Over toast or rice, if rice was to be had. Sometimes it was just bread and coffee. Sometimes a fried egg cracked with one hand and cooked in yesterday's grease. Sometimes, on rare and lucky nights, a slab of cold pie. These meals were not meant to impress. They were meant to comfort, to fill the hollow space between today and tomorrow, to help a man finish one more hand of cards, or make it through one more shift guarding cattle, or sleep just a little easier in the room upstairs with the thin blanket and the broken window latch. The saloon at night belonged to the quiet ones, gamblers with tired eyes and stacks of coins they didn't trust, cowboys who had just ridden into town after a long moonlit trail, women who had finished their last song or dance and now sat at the bar, barefooted, sipping weak tea with honey, cooks, cleaners, lonely people, and the food reflected that quiet. The cook didn't ask many questions, didn't need a full order. Sometimes it was just a nod, a muttered, "You got anything left?" And the answer was often a plate, set down gently, with no charge and no comment. There was an understanding in those hours, a mutual agreement to keep the noise down and the warmth up. Words were few, chewing was slow. The clatter of utensils seemed too loud, so fingers were used when possible. Every sound echoed a little more, the scrape of a spoon, the creak of a chair, the sip of hot coffee. Even the food seemed to take on a different weight. A plain biscuit at noon was forgettable. But that same biscuit at midnight, when the body was tired and the world had shrunk to the radius of a lantern's glow, tasted like kindness. And when the coffee came, even if it was hours old and bitter, it was received with quiet gratitude. Sometimes sipped slowly, sometimes knocked back like courage in a cup. The midnight meal also brought unlikely companionship, a poker player and a stable hand, both too tired to lie, sharing stew and silence, a traveling preacher and a saloon girl, splitting cornbread under the same candlelight, not speaking of faith or flirtation, just sharing warmth, a boy barely old enough to shave, asking the cook if he could sleep in the corner after his beans, and the cook, wordless, placing an old coat over his shoulders. These were moments not written in history books. But they mattered. They softened the frontier. They gave it soul. Sometimes the cook would sit down too, with a plate just like everyone else's. The rules of kitchen and counter melted away after midnight. In those hours, everyone was simply someone trying to get through the night. And in the flickering stillness, shared food became shared life. It didn't matter who had money, or a name, or a future. What mattered was the spoon, the bite, the steam rising into the hush of the room. Eventually, one by one, the eaters drifted off. The gambler to his room, the cowhand to the stables, the girl to her bunk, the boy, coat still wrapped around him, to a soft sleep near the dying stove. The cook finally to a moment of rest, perhaps even sleep if no one else knocked on the door, and the saloon itself exhaled. The lanterns flickered once more, then dimmed. The last plates sat stacked. In the sink, the coffee cooled. The world turned a little quieter. So the next time you find yourself hungry after midnight, tired, aching, uncertain, imagine the saloon. Not in its raucous, rowdy heyday, but in its quietest hour. Imagine the cook still awake, the pot still warm, the biscuit still soft in the center, because out there in the gentle dark the frontier had a heart, and it beat slowest, softest, sweetest at midnight. In the Wild West, stories traveled faster than trains. They moved on the backs of wagons, in the pockets of gamblers, in the steam rising from cups of black coffee. And nowhere did they settle more easily than around the saloon table. That rough wooden stage where meals were shared, secrets were traded, and the line between truth and tall tale blurred like dust on a sun-baked horizon. Food, as simple as it seemed, was never just food. It was luck. It was legend. It was a whispered charm or a terrible warning. Behind every slice of pie or bowl of stew, there was a story, told by firelight, punctuated with laughter, and passed down with the same reverence given to family heirlooms. Tonight, let's linger over those stories. Let's stir the pot of folklore and taste the myths that simmered alongside the meals of the saloon. The Lucky Chili. In more than one saloon across the West, there was talk of Lucky Chili, a batch made once a week by an old cook with a crooked eye and a sharper tongue. No one knew exactly what went into it. Some swore it was venison, others claimed rattlesnake. A few whispered about stranger things, desert herbs that grew where no rain ever fell, or beans soaked in rainwater collected from the roof of a church. The legend said that anyone who ate the chili on a Thursday, and only on a Thursday, would have a streak of luck lasting 3 days and 3 nights. Cards would fall your way. Dice would land right. Horses would gallop straighter, but only if you didn't speak during the first bite, and only if the cook nodded while serving it. More than one cowboy believed it. Some planned their whole week around it, and when it worked, it became part of the lore. When it didn't, well, they just blamed it on the beans. The cursed biscuit on the other side of the superstition spectrum was the cursed biscuit. It came, the story went, from a saloon out near El Paso, where a new cook, young, proud, too clean for comfort, tried to improve on the biscuit recipe passed down for 3 generations. He used fresh milk instead of lard. He folded the dough too many times. He served them warm, fluffy, and cursed. From the day those biscuits hit the table, misfortune struck. A gambler choked, a mirror shattered. The piano broke a key and played only sad songs for a week. The cook was let go, the old recipe restored. The saloon returned to normal, mostly, but ever since, some cowboys avoided the first biscuit of a fresh batch. "That's the cursed one," they'd mutter, letting someone else take the risk. And if someone did, they were watched closely the rest of the day, just in case lightning struck. The coffee that could predict the weather in the cold towns up north, there lived a belief that a good cook could tell the coming weather from a single pot of coffee. If the grounds rose too fast, snow. If the coffee turned bitter before boiling, wind. If it tasted sweet without sugar, rain. It was nonsense, of course, or so they said, but old-timers still waited for the cook to take that first sip, watching his eyebrows for any twitch. Storm's comin', he might say. And suddenly folks would hurry to their horses, mend their roofs, close their shutters. It didn't matter if it was real. It worked often enough to become truth. The pie that made you talk. Every saloon had its version of this tale. The dessert, so good, so perfect, that it loosened the tongue of even the quietest man. Some said it was a peach pie, served cold with thick cream. Others swore it was a cherry tart made by a widow who never smiled. Whatever the variation, the result was always the same. After one bite, the eater would begin to talk. Not just small talk, but truths. Deep ones. Funny ones. Dangerous ones. Confessions poured out like syrup. Hidden names. Secret loves. Lost. Fortunes. Some laughed, some wept. One man, they said, declared he'd found gold and ran out the door. He was never seen again. And so, in some saloons, men would eye the dessert tray with suspicion. They might whisper, "Is that the talking pie?" before declining politely, just in case. The midnight egg there was also the tale of the midnight egg, a lone hard-boiled egg left at the end of the bar long after the kitchen had closed. No one admitted to putting it there. No one saw who took it. But each night it appeared. Some said it belonged to a ghost cook, returning to finish one last task. Others believed it was a symbol of fortune. Take the egg, and your next journey would be safe. One man dared to eat it. He claimed it tasted of garlic, smoke, and sorrow. The next day he won 3 card games, lost his horse, and fell in love, all before sundown. After that, the egg remained untouched, but still, each night, there it was. Folklore as flavor. These stories were more than entertainment. They were seasoning. They gave depth to simple meals. They made the act of eating, already essential, something spiritual, mysterious, and oddly communal. Cooks played along. A wink here, a cryptic smile there. Don't stir the stew counterclockwise, one might say. It confuses the meat, and folks would laugh and follow the rule anyway, because in a land that took much and promised little, people clung to stories, to signs, to the hope that maybe, just maybe, a slice of pie could change your day. So next time you sit down to eat, think of the saloon, not just its food but its myths, the lucky chili, the cursed biscuit, the ghostly egg, the pie that made you spill your heart. They might not be true, but they were true enough for the people who needed them to be. And sometimes, that's all a story has to be. There were days in the Wild West when the saloon's kitchen shelves were full, and the air hummed with the scent of frying bacon and simmering beef. But then, there were the other days, the lean days, the meatless ones, when the butcher hadn't come, the delivery wagon got stuck in mud, or the only thing left hanging in the pantry was hope. Tonight, we open the back door of the saloon, not on a feast, but on necessity. On pots that bubble with beans, not bones. On creativity born from absence. Because when meat disappeared, the meal didn't stop. It simply changed. And in that change, something remarkable often happened. Let's step into the saloon kitchen on one of those quiet, meatless days and see what resilience tasted like. The first thing to understand is that meat in the frontier was never guaranteed. Even in towns with cattle nearby, supply was erratic. A snowstorm could trap wagons for weeks. A drought could thin herds. Disease might sweep through livestock, or war might claim the best cuts for the army. And so, saloons learned early to have a plan B and C, and sometimes D, E, and F. What resulted wasn't just survival, it was invention. The meatless menu became its own genre, hearty, surprising, and often more nourishing than the meaty meals folks craved. Beans, the old reliable. At the center of every meatless day were beans, dry, durable, cheap, and endlessly adaptable. Pinto, navy, red, black-eyed, and whatever the saloon could source. Soaked overnight, slow-boiled in salt water, and then doctored with onions, garlic, vinegar, or molasses if available. Some cooks added a spoonful of bacon grease from yesterday's breakfast to mimic the taste of meat. Others crushed dried chilies into the pot for depth. A sprig of wild thyme, a dash of stale beer, little touches that turned simplicity into comfort. A bowl of beans, served hot with a wedge of bread or a crumbling biscuit, could satisfy even the most carnivorous cowboy, at least until payday. Grains, grits, and ground cornmeal was the quiet hero of meatless meals. Cheap, fast, and filling, it formed the backbone of many saloon suppers, fried into cakes, boiled into mush, baked into heavy loaves, or used to thicken soups. Grits with butter and salt became a dinner in their own right. Spoon bread, a kind of soft cornbread pudding, appeared in towns with southern influence, served with molasses or even syrup if the cook had been lucky at cards. Oats made their appearance too, not just for breakfast porridge, but folded into griddle cakes, baked into oat cakes, or simmered into thin broths for the sick and tired. Rice was rarer but precious. When available, it was cooked slowly and topped with stewed vegetables, beans, or thickened gravy. A spoonful of rice under a ladle of beans was the closest thing many saw to a complete meal on lean days. Vegetables, from side to center. When meat disappeared, vegetables stepped up. Potatoes were the champion, mashed, fried, boiled, baked in ashes. They were filling, familiar, and incredibly forgiving. A stew of potatoes, onions, and wild greens could feed a crowd. Add some black pepper and a splash of vinegar, and even the grumpiest miner might ask for seconds. Cabbage, when it could be, stored properly, lasted for weeks. Sliced thin and fried with vinegar, it gave tang and crunch. Carrots, turnips, rutabagas, the humble roots of the earth, were roasted with lard or stewed in thin broths to form the base of many a no-meat meal. Even wild plants joined the mix. Dandelion greens, nettles, purslane, dock. They were foraged by cooks who knew the land, washed carefully and added to soups, hashes, or fried up with flour and oil. Tricks of the trade, making it feel like meat cooks were magicians in their own right. They understood texture, flavor, illusion. Brown flour in the pan to mimic the richness of meat gravy. Add blackstrap molasses for depth and darkness. Stir in old coffee for bitterness or leftover ale for umami. Smoke the onions before they go in the pot. Fry bread in bacon grease just to perfume the room. They also created mock meat from wheat flour, a precursor to what we now call seitan, made by washing the starch from flour until only gluten remained, then boiling it with seasonings until chewy. It wasn't steak, but it was close enough to fool a hungry man. The psychology of plenty. Even when the food was simple, presentation mattered. Serve the beans in a clean bowl, topped with a chopped onion. Brush the biscuit with grease to make it shine. Place a pickle spear beside a mound of grits. Fold the napkin. Offer the spoon warm from the kettle. Little touches told the eater, this is still a meal. You are still worthy of care. And the customers mostly understood. Meatless days were no one's fault. They were part of life. And if the cook had done their best, the empty plates said thank you. Stories that endured. Some men came to prefer the meatless meals. Said it made them feel lighter, think sharper. Others joked that beans gave you more than beef ever did, with a knowing glance and a quick step outside. And some said that on the leanest days, when there was nothing left but cornbread and old onions, that's when the cook's heart showed most clearly, because anyone can make steak taste good, but to make a meal out of scraps, that takes love. So next time you think of the saloon, don't picture only the sizzling meats and overflowing plates. Picture the quiet days, the empty hooks, the pots of beans stirred slowly, patiently, the clever hands folding dough with no butter, the plates passed across the counter with an apologetic smile and a hopeful shrug. And know that sometimes scarcity fed the deepest kinds of nourishment. Out on the open plains where the sky stretched wider than imagination and the dust rode the wind like an old ghost, not every saloon stood still. Some had no wooden floor, no swinging doors, no brass spittoon in the corner. Some saloons moved, with the men, the rails, the promise of gold, and their kitchens moved with them. Tonight, we follow those roving watering holes, the traveling saloons of the West, makeshift, impermanent, dusty as a trail boot, but full of fire, flavor, and the stubborn promise of a hot meal even in the middle of nowhere. These weren't polished establishments with piano players and printed menus. They were canvas tents, open wagons, or collapsible counters under the stars. But when the sun dipped low and the men gathered tired and hungry, these mobile saloons became the most welcome sight in the world. The iron horse brings the appetite. Wherever the railroad went, men followed. And wherever men followed, hunger followed, close behind. During the great push of railroad expansion in the 19th century, crews worked far from towns, laying track through wilderness and mountains. Towns had not yet reached these places, but enterprising spirits did. Some brought whiskey in barrels strapped to mules. Others came with wagons converted into kitchens, outfitted with shelves, griddles, and a firebox bolted to the floor. These makeshift saloons parked near rail camps and stayed for days, sometimes weeks. They served whiskey by the tin cup and beans by the ladle. Bread was baked in Dutch ovens sunk into the earth, meat grilled over open flames, coffee boiled in blackened pots with no handles. There were no tables, just barrels to lean on, crates to sit beside. The night's menu depended entirely on what the cook had managed to trade, hunt, or carry. And still, they came. Railmen with calloused hands, aching backs, and coin to spend. Because after a day of lifting iron, laying ties, and hearing the whistle scream against the wind, there was nothing better than the smell of something frying in lard under the moon. Cowboys and chuck wagons. The chuck wagon was the cowboy's version of a traveling saloon. Smaller, plainer, but no less important. On cattle drives that lasted weeks, a chuck wagon followed the herd like a loyal hound, loaded with everything needed to cook 3 meals a day for a dozen hungry men. The cook, affectionately called the cookie, was part saloon keeper, part doctor, part camp counselor. At night, the wagon would stop, the fire would crackle, and the lid of the wagon box would open like the curtain of a stage. Beans, biscuits, salt pork, coffee thick and black, sometimes jerky, sometimes stew, sometimes, if luck and land permitted, rabbit or bird shot fresh that morning. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't even variety. But it was food. And for the cowboys stretched out under the stars, that was more than enough. Boom towns and gold dust kitchens. When gold was found, in California, Colorado, the Dakotas, towns didn't just rise, they exploded. But before the buildings, before the banks, before the sheriff set up office, came the saloon. Sometimes nothing more than a barrel with a plank on top, and a cook with a single pot. These pop-up saloons served the prospectors, who flooded the hills with dreams in their pockets and nothing in their stomachs, and they were marvels of improvisation. The bar might be a wheelbarrow, the kitchen a lean-to made of old canvas, the grill a sheet of tin over a trench of burning logs. Yet somehow from these primitive setups came warmth, smell, and sustenance. Miners, covered in dirt and hope, would trade pinches of gold dust for hot coffee and a slice of cornbread. A man might walk 20 miles on aching feet just to sit on a log and eat beans beside a stranger who smelled of dynamite and pine. In those places, the saloon wasn't just a business, it was a beacon. What was on the movable menu? The food, though, humble, was built for the road. Everything was chosen for durability. Dried beans, flour, lard, coffee, sugar, cured meats. Vegetables were rare and treasured. Potatoes traveled well and appeared often, as did onions and dried apples. Canned goods, when available, were prized. Peaches, tomatoes, corned beef. Eggs were carried wrapped in oats or ash to protect them. Butter was a luxury, often replaced with bacon grease. The star of the traveling saloon meal was often the one-pot wonder, stew or hash or something bubbling with promise and mystery. No one asked what meat it was. No one cared. Flatbreads replaced biscuits on the worst days. Pancakes were made without milk. Molasses candy sometimes appeared, hardened by cold nights and softened by body heat. The food filled you. And in places where nothing else lasted, that was everything. A meal without walls. The charm of the traveling saloon wasn't just in what it served, but in how it gathered people. There were no doors to walk through, only smoke to follow. No chairs to pull out, just a patch of earth, a rock, or your own boots to sit on. And yet around those fires, strangers became comrades. Stories were told, cards were played, songs hummed through cracked lips. It was in many ways more saloon than the finest establishment in Dodge, because the saloon wasn't truly the bar, or the bottles, or the piano. It was the meal, the moment. The warmth passed from one plate to another, no matter how rough the wind blew. So next time you eat outdoors, at a campfire, on a porch, in a park, remember the traveling saloons of the West. The wagons that fed the workers, the tents that steamed with chili, the biscuits baked under starlight and the coffee poured in tin cups at sunrise. They fed the frontier. They followed the hunger. And for a brief moment, wherever they set up, they made the wide, wild world feel just a little bit like home. There are places that serve food, and there are places that serve something deeper. On the frontier, a plate of beans was never just a plate of beans. A hot cup of coffee in a chipped mug was sometimes the difference between despair and determination. And within the creaking walls of a Western saloon, past the smoke, the noise, the grit, there pulsed something quieter, a refuge. Tonight, we step into the saloon not as customers, but as weary souls. We feel the weight of the road behind us, the ache in our legs, the worry in our chest that hasn't quite left since the last bad news rode in on a horse. And in that state we cross the threshold, drawn not only by hunger but by the hope of being seen, if only for a moment. Let us explore how the saloon, so often painted as rowdy, reckless, and raucous, also became a sanctuary, not with walls, but with warmth. Not with silence, but with the comfort of clinking plates, low voices, and food that said in its own way, "You're safe for now." A place to sit down and breathe life in the West, rarely paused. Days began before sunrise and ended long after dusk, filled with labor, danger, and isolation. Men rode alone for weeks. Women worked endlessly in kitchens, fields, or boarding houses. Children grew up on the move, often with more chores than toys. So when one entered a saloon, dusty, sore, unsure, the act of simply sitting down at a table was an act of relief. A hot meal ordered without haggling. A drink placed in front of you without suspicion. A moment to loosen your belt, take off your hat, and exist, not as a role or a duty, but as a person. In that moment, the saloon became more than a business. It became a breathing space. The cook who knew behind the bar, beyond the heat of the stove, was the saloon cook, often the quiet heart of the operation. They didn't ask questions when someone came in looking worn down. They didn't pry when a plate went untouched for too long. They noticed. They paid attention. They'd offer an extra spoonful, slide a plate over with a bit more gravy. Say nothing, but say everything in the gesture. Cooks, more than anyone, knew that sometimes people didn't come for food. They came for reassurance, and the easiest way to give it was warm, well-seasoned, and served without judgment. Company in the chaos. Even in the loudest saloons, there were corners of calm. Tables where old men played cards not to win, but to pass time. Benches where women sipped weak tea and watched the fire. Spaces where conversation slowed, voices softened, and silence was allowed. For many, the saloon was the only place where loneliness didn't echo. You could sit among strangers and still feel less alone. Share a pot of stew and never speak a word. Laugh at a joke you only half heard and feel better for it. Borrow a newspaper, lean your head back, and simply be. And if you were lucky, someone might slide over a crust of bread, unasked. That in the West was as close to affection as most men knew how to offer. The meal as memory food, when done right, brings back what's been lost. A woman far from home might taste a biscuit and think of her mother's kitchen, where sunlight filtered through cotton curtains. A soldier might drink hot coffee and remember the morning before the battle, when everything was still quiet. A child might bite into cornbread and recall a time before they had to grow up too fast. These weren't grand memories, but they were grounding, and they reminded people that beneath the grime and the grit they were still human. In the saloon, a humble meal became a thread that tied the present to something softer, something safer. When the lights dimmed as night fell and lanterns flickered lower, the saloon often grew more intimate. The rowdy drinkers left. The piano went quiet. And those who remained did so with a kind of silent agreement. We're tired, we're here, and we need this place. It was then that the saloon revealed its gentler nature. A man might tell a story he hadn't spoken aloud in years. A woman might sing not for money, but because the mood asked for it. The cook might sit down with a bowl of beans and share it with the last customer of the night. And in those hours, the food felt warmer, the bread softer, the coffee sweeter. No questions asked, the refuge of the saloon wasn't just in what it gave, it was in what it didn't demand. You didn't have to explain yourself, didn't have to perform strength. If you were hungry, you were fed. If you had no coin, sometimes a task could be traded. A chopped stack of firewood, a mopped floor, a fixed hinge. If you needed to rest your head at the table for a while, you could. No one woke you unless they had to. And when you did wake, there might be something warm left on your plate, and someone pretending they didn't see the tears still drying on your cheek. A soft place in a hard land, in a world where danger was constant, where weather could turn deadly and men could be crueler than wolves. The saloon was often the only place with softness left. Not every saloon, not every night, but enough of them, enough nights. Softness in the form of stew, in the steam from a tin cup, in a fire that never went out, in the knowledge that for a few minutes or a few hours, you didn't have to fight for survival. You just had to eat. And that, more than anything, made the saloon not just a building, not just a business, but a refuge. In the dim light of a late western afternoon, the shadows grew longer than the buildings and every step echoed with more meaning. People didn't always announce when they were leaving. The West taught you that. But the ones paying attention could tell. A slower walk, a quieter breath, a longer look at the same old bar. And for those about to leave, town, life, or just a certain version of themselves, the saloon often became the last stop. Not for a drink, not always, but for something warmer, heavier, something that might, in its own quiet way, say goodbye. Tonight, we sit at the edge of a worn table where someone is having their last meal in a place they'll never see again. Whether it's a plate of beans, a thick cut of cornbread, or a cup of weak coffee held too long between trembling hands, the moment holds weight. This is the story of those last suppers, the final meals of the West, the quiet before the journey not. Every farewell was dramatic. Sometimes a man simply packed his bag, paid his tab, and sat down for one more plate before the stagecoach rolled in. The meal was often modest. A bowl of stew, 2 biscuits, strong coffee, no celebration, no fuss, just food. Familiar, reliable, something the traveler could carry in memory when the road ahead became strange. And yet, the cook knew. They always did. There was something in the way a man held his spoon or stared into the fire. Maybe they added an extra slice of pie. Maybe they said nothing, just offered a small nod when the plate was cleared. It wasn't about drama. It was about marking a moment. The departures that weren't coming back. Not all farewells were voluntary. Some meals were served to men whose paths had narrowed to a single point. A duel at dawn, a jailhouse hanging, or a last march toward battle. These meals carried a different silence. In some towns, the sheriff bought the final supper. In others, the prisoner requested it. The only choice they had left. And even the saloon cook, hardened by years of rowdy cowhands and hard-talking drifters, took extra care. Fried chicken if it could be spared, a sweet potato baked soft, coffee with sugar, bread still warm, and almost always, pie. Pie was memory, and memory was mercy. It wasn't much, but it was something. A final act of humanity before the world grew colder. Soldiers and the last home-cooked meal for young men called to war, or those choosing to ride toward it. The saloon meal was often the last taste of home. They'd gather the night before in small groups trying to laugh, trying not to show the fear beneath their boots. The cook, if they liked the boys, might make something special. Dumplings, fresh eggs, a roast if the house could manage it. They'd eat with big bites, as if trying to store it all up inside them. And then they'd sit, long after the food was gone, just listening to the creak of chairs, the scrape of spoons, the soft hum of a lullaby someone once sang near the fire. Come morning, they'd be gone. Some would come back. Some wouldn't. The saloon remembered all of them, leaving a place that had become home. Some farewells weren't forced. They were chosen, but heavy nonetheless. A woman who'd sung her last song in the corner. A cook who'd worn out their hands. A gambler who'd lost too much too often. People who had outgrown the dust, the noise, or the ghosts of the place. They'd come in for one final meal. The usual, they might say. Or maybe something they hadn't dared order in years. Steak, perhaps, or that bread pudding the new cook made on Sundays. They'd eat slowly, watching the room instead of their plate, smiling at familiar faces, feeling the weight of the years held gently in their hands like a warm biscuit. Sometimes someone would sit with them, sometimes not. But the air knew, the meal knew. And when they left quieter than they had arrived. Food, as farewell language. In these moments, food became more than sustenance. It became language. A full plate meant, you mattered. We'll remember. An extra biscuit meant, I wish you well. A second cup of coffee meant, you're not alone. A slice of pie without asking, I'll miss you. These were things not said, aloud. The West had never been good at saying things aloud, but they were felt, deeply. And long after the boots were gone from the porch and the bedroll had vanished from the floor, the kitchen remembered. That was his last meal. The cook might say one night, he liked the pie, and someone would nod, and for a moment the room would feel a little heavier. When the one leaving was you, sometimes, it wasn't someone else. It was you. You knew you weren't coming back. Not because of danger, not always, but because you had changed. The town had changed. And the saloon, for all its comfort, now held more memory than peace. So you sat at your old table, ordered the same thing as always, looked at the cook and said, thank you, like you meant it. Because you did. And when you stood, full but hollow, you knew the goodbye wasn't just to a meal or a place, it was to a piece of yourself. So when you think of the West, don't just imagine the shootouts and the songs. Think of the farewells, quiet, dignified, wrapped in steam and served with a spoon. Think of the last meal shared, not with fanfare but with reverence. Because in the end, even in the wildest place, people longed not just to be fed, but to be remembered. There is a kind of quiet that falls at the end of a long journey. Not silence exactly, but a hush, like the world is catching its breath. And here, at the end of our story, in the dim light of a saloon long since closed, we sit with that, quiet. The floors have been swept, the lanterns trimmed, the last chairs upended and resting on tables. The fire, down to embers, still glows faintly in the hearth. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. A soft clatter of spoons, the gentle scrape of a bowl being pushed across a counter, the low hum of voices made warm by something cooked slow and served without rush. This is the echo of a saloon meal. And tonight, in the final pages of our story, we stay just a little longer to remember it, not just with history, but with heart. More than meat and beans, we've spoken of menus, of biscuits and stews, pies and puddings, coffee and chili. We've traced the ingredients, the customs, the seasons, but the soul of a saloon meal was never in the recipe. It was in the reason. People came hungry, yes, but not just for food. They came hungry for company, for rest, for the feeling of being seen, even in passing. They came because the world outside was uncertain, and the table inside offered, if not answers, then at least a moment of peace. A meal might last only minutes, but the feeling of steam rising, of a fork clinking gently against a tin plate, of another presence across the table, that stayed, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. The taste of memory, Ask someone who's grown old what they remember most. It won't always be a date, a name, or a headline, but it might be this: the taste of cornbread soaked in chili eaten with cold fingers beside a fire. The way pie smelled at dusk, just before the wind changed. The sound of a coffee pot rattling at sunrise when they were too young to drink it but loved the ritual all the same. The first time someone handed them a full plate and said, "Sit, eat," and meant it. Food holds memory in a way nothing else does. It lodges in the senses, wraps itself around a place, a person, a time, and stays. Long after the buildings are gone and the cook has passed and the plates have rusted in the earth, what remains is the feeling. I was fed, I was safe, I was there. The spirit of the saloon modern life doesn't offer many saloons anymore. But their spirit lingers. You see it in the diner that stays open past midnight for the last few regulars. You hear it in the rattle of a pan in a church basement, where a volunteer stirs soup for strangers. You feel it in a neighbor's hand, offering a hot dish after a long week. You find it in the warmth of a meal shared with no expectation beyond presence. That's the saloon spirit. Food as a bridge, as a comfort, as a reminder that no matter how hard the trail, you're not alone. A final bite. Let's imagine now for just a moment that you're the one sitting in the last chair by the fire. Outside, the wind has quieted. The horses have stopped pawing the dirt. Inside, only the cook remains, wiping down a counter that's seen better days but still stands proud. They bring you something, maybe a bowl of beans, simple and warm, maybe a biscuit, a little dry but fresh, maybe just a mug of coffee, rich and dark. You take it. You eat slowly. You look around, not searching, but noticing, and in that moment you understand. This wasn't just a meal. It was an invitation to be human, to pause, to remember that even here and in this wild, wide land, someone thought to feed you and you're grateful. The story that never ends, and so we end our tale, not with a bang, not with a farewell, but with a lingering scent, a quiet clink, and the slow fade of warmth into the cool hush of night. The saloon doors may swing shut, but the memory of food, of kindness, of the small sacred act of sitting down to eat, remains. Wherever you are, whoever you've been, may you always find such a meal, and may its echo, gentle, steady, and full, to guide you toward rest. Good night.